Jack Thornton was bleeding out in the desert sand minutes from death when two horses appeared and did something that should have been impossible. They planted themselves over his dying body like guardians, refusing to leave a stranger they had no reason to save. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The desert had a way of making a man realize just how small he was. Jack Thornton had always known this truth, had lived with it for the better part of 32 years, but never had he felt it quite so acutely as he did now, lying face down in the sand with blood seeping through his shirt and the taste of copper thick on his tongue. The fall from his horse had happened so fast that his mind was still trying to catch up with his body, still processing the moment when the rattlesnake had struck, when his mare had reared in terror, when the world had tilted sideways and the ground had rushed up to meet him with brutal finality. Pain radiated from his left side where he had landed on the rocks, sharp and insistent, demanding attention he could not afford to give it. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, a reminder of the gash above his eyebrow that was bleeding freely into his eye, blurring his vision with red. But worse than the pain, worse than the blood, was the understanding that he was alone out here, miles from the nearest ranch with no water, no shelter, and a body that was rapidly failing him. The sun hung overhead like a merciless judge, its heat pressing down on him with suffocating intensity, turning the air itself into something thick and hostile. He had been tracking strays for 3 days, riding the boundary of the Morrison Ranch where he had worked for the past 5 years. It was honest work, solitary work, the kind that suited a man who had learned early that depending on others only led to disappointment. His mare, a dependable sorrel named Ruby, had carried him faithfully through countless miles of rough terrain, never once giving him cause for concern. But even the best horse could not overcome instinct when a rattlesnake struck without warning, its fangs missing Ruby's fetlock by mere inches. The mare had bolted, and Jack, exhausted from days in the saddle and caught off guard, had lost his seat. He could hear Ruby in the distance, her hoofbeats fading as panic drove her away from the snake and away from him. He tried to call out to her, but his voice came out as little more than a wheeze, swallowed immediately by the vast emptiness around him. The effort of trying to speak sent new waves of pain through his ribs, and he suspected that at least 2 of them were broken, possibly more. Every breath felt like knives being driven into his chest, and he had to consciously slow his breathing, forcing himself to take shallow, careful pulls of the scorching air. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of sand and scrub brush punctuated by distant mesas that shimmered like mirages in the heat. It was beautiful in its own harsh way, this land that forgave nothing and offered even less. Jack had always respected it, had learned its moods and rhythms over years of riding its trails, but respect and understanding did not guarantee mercy. The desert took what it wanted, and right now it seemed determined to take him. He managed to roll onto his back, the movement costing him dearly in terms of pain and rapidly depleting energy. The sky above was impossibly blue, unmarred by even a single cloud that might offer temporary relief from the sun's assault. Vultures would be circling soon, he thought with grim humor. They always knew when something was dying out here. They could sense it from miles away, that particular stillness that preceded death, the way life force began to ebb and flow outward like water from a cracked vessel. His canteen was still attached to Ruby's saddle, along with his provisions, his bedroll, and any hope of surviving more than a few hours in this heat. The irony was not lost on him that he had spent his entire adult life preparing for every possible contingency on the range, had prided himself on being self-sufficient and capable, and yet here he was, undone by a snake he had never even seen, and a moment of carelessness that would likely cost him everything. The images came unbidden, flooding his mind with the clarity that sometimes accompanies the approach of death. His mother's face, weathered and kind, the way she had looked the last time he saw her before the fever took her when he was 14. His father, stern and distant, who had taught him to ride and rope, but never to hope for much beyond hard work and harder luck. The string of failed relationships and missed opportunities that had characterized his adult life, each one another brick in the wall he had built around himself, another reason to stay alone, stay moving, stay just ahead of whatever ghosts might be chasing him. He had never married, never settled, never allowed himself to become attached to anything that could not be packed on a horse and carried to the next job. It had seemed like wisdom at the time, a way to protect himself from the pain of loss that had defined his childhood. But lying here now, bleeding into the sand, with no one to know or care that he was dying, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps the fear of pain had caused him to miss out on everything that made life worth living. Perhaps solitude was not strength, but simply another form of cowardice. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Jack felt consciousness beginning to slip away from him like sand through his fingers. His body was shutting down, conserving what little energy remained, preparing for the end that seemed inevitable now. He closed his eyes, or perhaps they closed on their own. He could no longer tell the difference. The darkness that crept in at the edges of his vision was almost welcome, a respite from the brutal brightness of the desert sun. He did not see them approach, did not hear the soft sound of hoofbeats on sand, or the gentle nickering that horses use to communicate with each other, did not feel the shadow that fell across his face as two animals moved to stand over him, blocking the sun with their bodies. Jack Thornton had given up, had surrendered to the desert that he had always known would claim him eventually. But the desert, it seemed, was not quite finished with him yet. Consciousness returned in fragments, pieces of awareness that did not quite fit together into a coherent whole. Jack became aware first of shadow, blessed relief from the sun that had been cooking him alive just moments before. Then came the sounds, soft breathing that was not his own, the shuffle of hooves in sand, and a low whickering that seemed almost conversational in nature. His mind, still foggy from pain and dehydration, struggled to make sense of these sensations. Perhaps he was already dead, and this was some strange transition between one world and the next. He forced his eyes open, though the effort felt like lifting boulders, and found himself staring up at two horses standing over him like sentinels. They were positioned on either side of his body, their bulk creating a protective canopy that shielded him from the worst of the desert sun. The horse on his left was a palomino, its coat the color of butter and honey, its white mane catching the light like spun silver. The other was a bay, deep reddish-brown with a black mane and tail, its eyes dark and intelligent as it gazed down at him with what appeared to be concern. For a long moment, Jack simply stared, convinced that he was hallucinating. Horses did not behave this way. They were flight animals, creatures of instinct who ran from danger and rarely showed interest in anything that did not directly concern their own survival. Yet these two animals stood perfectly still, deliberately positioning themselves to provide shade, watching him with an attentiveness that seemed almost human in its intentionality. The palomino lowered its head, its soft muzzle brushing against his face with surprising gentleness. The touch was real, tangible, too specific to be a product of his dying mind. Jack tried to speak, to make some sound of acknowledgement, but his throat was too dry, his tongue thick and useless in his mouth. The horse seemed to understand his distress, its breath warm against his cheek, and there was something in that simple contact that felt like reassurance, like a promise that he was not as alone as he had believed. The bay moved slightly, adjusting its position to better block the sun as it shifted in the sky. The deliberateness of the action struck Jack as remarkable. These were not wild horses wandering aimlessly through the desert. They moved with purpose, with coordination, as if they had made a conscious decision to help him. But that was impossible, was it not? Horses did not make such decisions. They did not understand the concept of a man dying in the desert and choose to intervene. Yet here they were, defying everything Jack knew about animal behavior, standing guard over a stranger who could offer them nothing in return. The palomino nickered softly, and the bay responded with a low rumble from deep in its chest. They were communicating, Jack realized, though he could not begin to guess what they might be saying to each other. Were they debating whether to stay or go? Were they trying to figure out what to do with this broken human they had found? Memory began to reassemble itself in Jack's mind, pieces clicking into place with painful clarity. He had been thrown from Ruby. He had injuries that were serious, possibly life-threatening. He had no water, no supplies, no way to call for help. The nearest ranch was at least 15 miles away, probably more given how far he had ranged in pursuit of those strays. Even if he could somehow get to his feet, even if his ribs were not broken and his head was not bleeding, he would never survive the walk in this heat. But these horses, they were saddled, or rather they had been saddled recently. Jack could see the marks on the palomino's back where a saddle had rested, the slight rubbing pattern on its coat that spoke of regular use. The bay showed similar signs, and both animals bore the well-groomed appearance of horses that were cared for, not wild mustangs that had never known human touch. They belonged to someone, which meant there were people nearby, or at least there had been people nearby recently enough that these horses had not yet reverted to their wild instincts. Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered to life in Jack's chest. If these horses had riders, if those riders were searching for their missing animals, then perhaps rescue was possible. Perhaps he would not die alone in the sand after all. But even as the thought formed, doubt crept in to undermine it. The desert was vast, and two horses without riders could travel far in a short time. Their owners might be miles away, searching in completely the wrong direction, and by the time anyone thought to look here, Jack would be long past saving. The palomino shifted its weight, and Jack noticed something he had missed before in his pain-addled state. There was a rope trailing from its halter. Not a lead rope, but something longer, something that looked like it might have been tied to a hitching post or perhaps to another horse. The same was true of the bay. Both animals had broken free from something which suggested they had been secured somewhere and had chosen to leave. But why would they come here? What possible reason could two horses have for seeking out a dying man in the middle of nowhere, unless they were not the ones who had left their riders, unless something had happened to the people who owned them, something that had spooked the horses or forced them to flee? Jack's mind conjured images of bandits, of accidents, of any number of catastrophes that could befall travelers in this unforgiving country. If that were true, if these horses were also refugees from some disaster, then they were as lost as he was, and his hope of rescue dimmed accordingly. The bay lowered its head and sniffed at his vest, its whiskers tickling his neck. Jack managed to lift one hand, the movement costing him dearly, and touched the animal's face. The horse did not pull away, did not startle at the contact. Instead, it leaned into his palm, accepting his touch as if they were old friends rather than strangers, meeting under the worst possible circumstances. The simple act of connection, of touching another living creature, brought unexpected tears to Jack's eyes. He had been alone for so long, by choice and by circumstance, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter to anyone or anything. These horses, whatever their reasons for being here, had given him that gift. They had found him when he was ready to die, and they had stayed when they could have easily walked away. It might not be enough to save his life, but it was something, a final kindness in a world that had shown him precious little kindness over the years. The sun continued its relentless arc across the sky, and the horses adjusted their positions accordingly, maintaining the shade that was keeping Jack from cooking in his own skin. His thirst was becoming unbearable, his lips cracked and bleeding, his throat raw with the need for water. He would die of dehydration long before infection could set in from his wounds. That much was certain. The human body could survive only 3 days without water, and he had already been out here for most of one day with no relief in sight. The palomino suddenly lifted its head, ears swiveling forward with sharp attention. The bay responded immediately, its entire body going alert, muscles tensing beneath its glossy coat. Both horses were focused on something in the distance, something Jack could not see from his position on the ground. He tried to turn his head, tried to follow their gaze, but the movement sent fresh agony shooting through his neck and shoulders, and he abandoned the effort with a groan that came out as barely a whisper. For several heartbeats, the horses remained frozen, listening to something only they could hear. Then the palomino nickered, a sound that carried an unmistakable note of recognition, perhaps even relief. The bay answered with a deeper call, and both animals shifted their weight, their bodies relaxing slightly. Whatever they had sensed, it was not a threat, or at least not a threat to them. Jack felt a surge of wild hope. If the horses recognized whatever was approaching, if they were responding with familiarity rather than fear, then perhaps their owners were near. Perhaps his desperate situation was about to change. He tried to call out, tried to make some sound that might carry to whoever was coming, but his voice failed him completely. The best he could manage was a harsh rasp that went nowhere, swallowed by the desert air before it could travel more than a few feet. The palomino moved then, stepping away from its position over Jack's body. He felt the loss of its shade immediately, the sun finding his face with renewed intensity. But before panic could set in, the horse did something that defied all logic and reason. It lowered itself to the ground beside him, folding its legs with the careful precision of a horse that had been trained to lie down on command. The animal positioned itself so that its body created a barrier between Jack and the sun, its bulk providing even more complete shade than it had while standing. The bay followed suit a moment later, lowering itself on Jack's other side. The two horses now bracketed him completely, their bodies forming a living shelter that blocked not just the sun, but also some of the wind that had been sucking moisture from his skin with every gust. Jack found himself surrounded by the warmth of their bodies, the steady rhythm of their breathing, the earthy smell of horse and leather and sweat. It was the most protected he had felt since his fall, and he was struck once again by the impossibility of it all. Horses did not behave this way. They did not lie down beside injured strangers. They did not coordinate their movements to provide maximum comfort and protection. They did not show this level of intelligence and compassion. Yet these two animals were doing exactly that, and Jack had no explanation for it except that perhaps, in his extremity, he had stumbled upon something rare and inexplicable, some quality in these particular horses that set them apart from their kind. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and Jack realized that more horses were approaching, many more from the sound of it. His heart began to race, adrenaline giving him a temporary boost of clarity. This was it. This was either rescue or the final chapter in a very short and painful story. If the approaching riders were friendly, if they had water and medical supplies, he might survive this. If they were not, if they were bandits or outlaws or simply people who did not care about the fate of a dying cowboy, then the palomino and bay's vigil would end in failure. The horses beside him remained calm, their breathing steady and unhurried. Whatever was coming, they trusted it. That should have reassured Jack, but his years of solitary wandering had taught him that trust was often misplaced, that the world was full of people who would take advantage of vulnerability without a second thought. He had learned that lesson early and had lived by it ever since, keeping his distance from others, never allowing himself to depend on anyone for anything. Yet here he was, completely dependent on the kindness of strangers and the inexplicable compassion of two horses he had never met before. The irony was bitter and sharp, cutting through even the fog of pain that surrounded him. All his life, he had prided himself on his independence, his ability to handle whatever the frontier threw at him without asking for help. And now, when it mattered most, he was as helpless as a newborn calf, unable to even sit up without assistance, let alone defend himself or make his own way to safety. The riders appeared over a low rise, silhouettes against the bright sky that resolved themselves into individual figures as they drew closer. Jack counted 6 of them, all mounted on good horses, moving with the easy confidence of experienced riders. They wore the practical clothing of working cowboys, broad-brimmed hats to keep off the sun, vests over work shirts, chaps to protect their legs from brush and thorns. One of them, riding slightly ahead of the others, raised a hand in greeting when he spotted the Palomino and Bay lying in the sand. The lead rider's shout carried clearly across the desert, a single word that sounded like a name, though Jack could not make it out clearly. The Palomino raised its head and whinnied in response, and the relief in the sound was unmistakable. These horses knew these people. They belonged to them. And they had somehow led them back to this spot, back to Jack, though he could not begin to understand how or why. The riders approached at a trot, the lead man spurring his horse forward when he saw Jack lying between the 2 animals. He was out of his saddle before his horse had fully stopped, dropping to his knees beside the Palomino and placing one hand on the horse's neck in a gesture that spoke of deep affection and relief. Then his eyes fell on Jack, and the expression on his weathered face shifted from joy to shock to immediate concern. The man was in his 50s, Jack guessed, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of permanent squint that came from years of staring into bright horizons. His face was deeply tanned and lined with the marks of a life spent outdoors, and his hands, as he reached out to check Jack's pulse, were calloused, but surprisingly gentle. He called over his shoulder to the other riders, his voice carrying the sharp edge of command that suggested he was used to being obeyed. The other men dismounted quickly, moving with the organized efficiency of people who had worked together long enough to anticipate each other's actions. One of them produced a canteen, unscrewing the cap with practiced ease. Another began unrolling what looked like a canvas stretcher from behind his saddle. A third, younger than the others, and with the earnest face of someone still learning his trade, knelt on Jack's other side and began examining his wounds with careful attention. The leader lifted Jack's head with one hand, supporting it while he brought the canteen to his lips with the other. The first sip of water was pure agony, burning down Jack's raw throat like liquid fire, but he forced himself to swallow, then take another sip, and another. The man was careful not to let him drink too much too fast, pulling the canteen away when Jack tried to gulp greedily, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice that reminded him of the way his mother used to talk when he was sick as a child. "Easy now," the man said, his voice rough but kind. "You've been out here a while from the looks of it. Too much water too fast will make you sick. We're going to get you fixed up, but you need to take it slow." His hand remained steady on the back of Jack's head, and there was something in that simple touch, that human connection, that made Jack's eyes burn with tears he was too dehydrated to shed. The younger man examining Jack's wounds looked up at the leader with an expression that carried both concern and uncertainty. "He's got at least 2 broken ribs, maybe more. Head wound looks worse than it probably is, but he's lost a fair amount of blood. The real problem is going to be moving him without making things worse." His voice had the careful precision of someone who had received medical training, perhaps serving as the camp doctor or medic for this outfit. The leader nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll use the stretcher and take it slow. Charlie, you and Hank get the wagon. We left it about 2 miles back when the terrain got too rough. Bring it as close as you can manage. The rest of us will get him stabilized here and start moving him toward you." 2 of the men mounted immediately and rode off at a gallop, kicking up plumes of dust that hung in the still air like ghosts. Jack tried to speak again, tried to ask about the horses, about how they had found him, about who these people were and why they were helping him. But his voice remained useless, and the effort of trying sent sharp pains through his chest that made him gasp. The young medic placed a hand on his shoulder, gently but firmly, keeping him still. "Don't try to talk yet. Save your strength. We're going to take care of you, but you need to let us work." The Palomino and Bay had risen to their feet when the riders arrived, moving aside to give the men room to work but not wandering far. They stood just beyond the circle of activity, watching with that same attentive intelligence Jack had noticed before. The leader glanced at them frequently, and there was something in his expression when he looked at those horses that spoke of deep emotion, perhaps even awe. After the medic had cleaned and bandaged Jack's head wound, after they had carefully checked his ribs and wrapped his torso with strips of cloth torn from someone's spare shirt, the leader sat back on his heels and really looked at Jack for the first time. His eyes were blue, faded by sun and time, but sharp with the kind of perception that came from years of reading men and situations. "Who are you, and how in God's name did you end up out here with my horses standing guard over you like you were the most precious thing in the territory?" Jack managed to croak out his name, the single word costing him more effort than it should have. The leader nodded slowly, as if filing the information away for later consideration. "I'm Thomas Brennan. I own the Triple Crown Ranch about 12 miles north of here. These are some of my men. And those two horses," he gestured toward the Palomino and Bay, "those are Goldie and Russet. They've been with my family for going on 8 years now, and in all that time, I've never seen them do anything like what they did for you today." One of the remaining men, an older cowboy with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelty, spoke up from where he was preparing the stretcher. "Horses don't act like that, boss. Not natural horses anyway. There's something different about those two, always has been. My grandmother would have said they had old souls, that they remembered things from before they were horses." The comment earned him a few skeptical looks from the other men, but Brennan did not dismiss it out of hand. Jack's mind was working slowly, processing information through layers of pain and exhaustion, but certain facts were beginning to crystallize. These horses belonged to the Brennan family. They had somehow escaped or been separated from their riders, and they had found him, a complete stranger, and chosen to protect him from the desert's worst until help could arrive. The statistical improbability of it all was staggering, and yet here he was, alive because of a sequence of events that defied rational explanation. Brennan seemed to read some of the questions in Jack's expression. "We were driving cattle to summer pasture when we got hit by a flash flood yesterday evening. Came out of nowhere the way they do out here. We lost a few head, and in the chaos, Goldie and Russet broke free from the remuda. My daughter was supposed to be watching them specifically." He paused, and pain flickered across his features. "Sarah's only 16, and she's been beside herself with guilt since they disappeared. These aren't just any horses to our family. They're special." The way he said the word special carried weight beyond its simple meaning. Jack wanted to ask why, wanted to understand what made these particular animals so important, but his body was reaching the limits of what it could endure. The world was starting to fade at the edges again, darkness creeping in despite his efforts to stay conscious. He fought against it, driven by a need to understand, to make sense of the miracle that had saved his life. The medic noticed Jack's increasing distress and leaned in close. "You need to rest now. We're going to get you to the ranch, get you properly treated, and then we can talk about all of this. But right now, your body needs to shut down and start healing. Don't fight it." There was authority in his voice, the kind that came from experience with injured men who tried to push themselves beyond their limits. Brennan stood and walked over to where Goldie and Russet waited patiently. He placed a hand on each of their necks, his head bowed as if in prayer, or perhaps simply in gratitude. Jack watched through increasingly blurred vision as the rancher spoke quietly to the horses, words too low to hear but clearly meaningful. The animals leaned into his touch, accepting his affection with the calm assurance of creatures who knew they were loved and valued. The sound of approaching wagon wheels broke the moment and Brennan turned back to his men with renewed purpose. "All right, let's get him loaded carefully. I want 2 men on each corner of the stretcher, slow and steady. If those ribs puncture a lung, he won't make it back to the ranch." The men moved with practiced efficiency, lifting Jack with surprising gentleness for men whose hands were more accustomed to rough work than delicate handling. The transfer to the stretcher brought fresh waves of agony that made Jack's vision white out completely for several seconds. He heard himself make sounds that might have been screams if his voice had been working properly, heard the medic's calm voice instructing the others to adjust their grip, to move slower, to be mindful of his injuries. Then he was being carried across the sand, the motion somehow both smooth and jarring, each step sending vibrations through his broken body. The wagon appeared in his limited field of vision, and Jack recognized it as one of the sturdy freight wagons used by ranchers to transport supplies across rough terrain. Someone had lined the bed with blankets and what looked like hay to create a cushioned surface. The men lifted the stretcher with coordinated precision, sliding it into the wagon bed with minimal jostling. The medic climbed in beside him, arranging the blankets to provide support and protection from the worst of the bumps that were inevitable on the journey ahead. Brennan appeared at the side of the wagon, his weathered face serious. "We're going to move as fast as we safely can, but it's still going to be a rough few hours. Try to stay as still as possible. My wife is a skilled healer, better than most doctors I've known. She'll take good care of you when we get you home." There was promise in his words, a commitment that went beyond simple neighborly assistance. As the wagon began to move, Jack felt the darkness closing in again, pulling him down into unconsciousness with irresistible force. His last conscious sight was of Goldie and Russet walking alongside the wagon, flanking it like honor guards. Their presence was oddly comforting, as if they had appointed themselves his protectors and intended to see their duty through to completion. In the fading moments before sleep claimed him completely, Jack found himself thinking that perhaps the world was not quite as cold and indifferent as he had spent his life believing. Jack woke to whiteness and pain, though the pain had changed in character from the sharp, screaming agony of broken bones to a deep, persistent ache that spoke of healing already begun. His eyes struggled to focus, taking in whitewashed walls, clean cotton sheets, and sunlight filtering through gauze curtains that moved gently in a breeze he could feel on his face. The air smelled of herbs and something medicinal, sharp but not unpleasant. He was in a bed, a real bed with a proper mattress and pillows, and the simple luxury of it made him want to weep. A woman sat in a chair beside the bed, her hands busy with some kind of needlework. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair threaded with silver and pulled back in a practical bun. Her face carried the kind of beauty that came from character, rather than mere features, lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and tears in equal measure. She looked up when she heard him stir, and her expression transformed from concentration to warm concern in an instant. "You're awake." Her voice was gentle, but carried an undertone of authority that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to. "That's good. You've been drifting in and out for 2 days now. How do you feel?" She set aside her needlework and moved to pour water from a pitcher on the bedside table, supporting his head with practiced ease as she helped him drink. The water was cool and sweet, the best thing he had ever tasted in his life. Jack tried to speak, found his voice was working better than it had been in the desert, though it still came out as little more than a rasp. "Where am I?" The question seemed inadequate given the circumstances, but it was the most basic thing he needed to know. The woman smiled, settling back into her chair, but keeping her attention focused entirely on him. "You're at the Triple Crown Ranch in our guest room. I'm Catherine Brennan. My husband and his men brought you here after they found you in the desert." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel as if she could see straight through to his soul. "After Goldie and Russet found you, I should say. Those horses saved your life, Mr. Thornton. Another few hours in that sun and there would have been nothing anyone could do for you. Memory came rushing back, fragments assembling themselves into a coherent narrative. The fall from Ruby. The hours lying in the sand waiting to die. The inexplicable appearance of two horses who had stood guard over him, protected him, somehow led rescuers to his location. It still seemed impossible, the stuff of fever dreams rather than actual events, but the evidence was all around him. He was alive. He was being cared for. And somehow, against all odds and logic, he had been saved by animals who should have had no reason to care whether he lived or died. "My ribs," he managed to say. "The head wound. How bad is it?" Catherine's expression grew more serious, though not grave. 2 cracked ribs, 1 broken. The head wound looked dramatic, but was mostly superficial, though you have a concussion that's going to make your head ache for a while. Severe dehydration and exhaustion. Some bruising and scrapes that will heal on their own. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his. "You're going to recover fully, Mr. Thornton, but it's going to take time and rest. The ribs especially need at least 6 weeks to heal properly." 6 weeks. The time frame hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. He could not afford to be laid up for 6 weeks. He had work, responsibilities, a horse that was probably still running loose somewhere in the desert. He tried to sit up, driven by a lifetime of self-reliance that insisted he could not burden these strangers with his problems. Pain immediately reminded him of his limitations, and Catherine's hand was on his shoulder before he could get more than a few inches off the pillow. "Don't even think about it." Her voice had steel beneath the gentleness now. "You're not going anywhere until those ribs are healed, and I'm satisfied you're not going to collapse the moment you stand up. My husband has already sent men to search for your horse. They found her this morning, actually, drinking at one of our water holes. She's in our stable now, being well cared for, so you can let go of that worry." The relief Jack felt at knowing Ruby was safe was disproportionate to the circumstances, but then again, everything about the past few days had been disproportionate. He settled back against the pillows, his body making the decision his mind was struggling with. He was not going anywhere, not in his current condition, and fighting against that reality would only slow his recovery. It was a hard lesson for a man who had spent his adult life refusing to depend on anyone. Catherine seemed to sense the struggle happening behind his eyes. "I know this isn't easy for you. Thomas told me you were alone when they found you. No partner, no camp nearby. You're used to taking care of yourself." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But sometimes life puts us in situations where we have to accept help, whether we want to or not. There's no shame in it, Mr. Thornton. There's only wisdom in recognizing when we need others." The words struck deeper than Jack expected, touching on truths he had spent years avoiding. He had always prided himself on his independence, had viewed asking for help as a weakness to be avoided at all costs. But lying here, broken and helpless, he was being forced to confront the limits of that philosophy. Sometimes it seemed survival itself required the willingness to accept what others offered, to acknowledge that no man was truly an island, regardless of how much he might wish to be. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and a young girl entered carrying a tray laden with food. She was perhaps 16, with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, and she moved with the careful balance of someone transporting something precious. She set the tray on the bedside table, then turned to look at Jack with undisguised curiosity and something that might have been relief. "You're awake." The girl's voice carried a tremor of emotion that suggested she had been worried about his condition. "I'm Sarah Brennan. I'm the one who was supposed to be watching Goldie and Russet when they broke free during the flood." Her voice dropped, carrying guilt and something close to shame. "If I had been paying better attention, if I hadn't let them get away, you wouldn't have gotten hurt trying to save them." The assumption in her words took Jack by surprise, and he realized what she thought had happened. She believed he had been trying to help the horses, that his injuries had come from some attempt at rescue that had gone wrong. It was a kinder interpretation than the truth, which was simply that he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and had been saved by a stroke of luck that defied explanation. Catherine intervened before Jack could correct the misunderstanding. "Sarah, honey, we don't know exactly what happened out there. What matters is that everyone is safe now. Why don't you help Mr. Thornton eat something? He needs to rebuild his strength." The girl nodded, though her eyes remained troubled, and she began arranging the tray so Jack could reach it more easily. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, broth with vegetables and soft bread that would be easy on a stomach that had been empty too long. Sarah helped support him as he ate, her hands steady despite the emotion he could see in her face. As he swallowed the warm broth, feeling it spread strength through his depleted body, Jack found himself studying the girl with interest. There was something about her, a quality of deep feeling and sensitivity that reminded him of himself at that age before life had taught him to guard his heart so carefully. "You love those horses very much." It was not a question, but an observation, and Sarah's eyes immediately filled with tears. She tried to blink back. "They're not just horses." Her voice was fierce with conviction. "They're family. Goldie and Russet came to us 8 years ago, and from the first day they were different, special. They understand things that horses shouldn't understand. They care about people in a way that's almost human." Catherine placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, a gesture of support and understanding. "Sarah has a gift with animals, always has, ever since she was small. But her connection with Goldie and Russet is something beyond the ordinary. They trust her completely, and she trusts them. When they disappeared in the flood, she was devastated." Jack finished the broth and found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to do so. "They saved my life. I don't understand how or why, but those horses found me when I was dying, and they protected me until help arrived. You have no reason to feel guilty, Sarah. If anything, I owe them a debt I can never repay." The tears Sarah had been holding back finally spilled over, running down her cheeks in quiet streams. She wiped at them with the back of her hand, embarrassed but also clearly moved by his words. "I knew they would come back. Everyone else thought they might be lost for good, that the desert would swallow them up, but I knew. They always come back when someone needs them." Her voice carried absolute conviction, the kind of certainty that came from personal experience rather than wishful thinking. Catherine exchanged a glance with her daughter that spoke of shared knowledge, some understanding between them that Jack was not privy to. There was a story here, layers beneath the surface that he could sense but not yet see. These people, this family, they had history with those horses that went deeper than simple ownership. Whatever made Goldie and Russet special, it was something the Brennans understood in ways he could not yet comprehend. Sarah gathered up the empty dishes, preparing to leave, but she paused at the door and looked back at Jack with an intensity that made him feel as though he were being measured against some invisible standard. "Would you like to see them? Goldie and Russet? They've been restless since we brought you in. Papa says it's almost like they're worried about you, checking to make sure you're being taken care of." The suggestion seemed impossible, yet no more impossible than anything else that had happened. "I would like that very much," Jack replied, surprised by how true the words were. He did want to see the horses again, needed to somehow thank them, or at least acknowledge what they had done for him. Sarah's face brightened immediately, and she nodded before slipping out of the room with renewed purpose. Catherine watched her daughter go with an expression that mixed maternal pride with something more complicated, perhaps concern. Once Sarah was gone, Catherine turned her full attention back to Jack, and he felt the weight of her scrutiny. She was assessing him, he realized, trying to determine what kind of man he was and whether he could be trusted with whatever secrets this family held. The examination was thorough and uncomfortable, but Jack had learned long ago not to flinch under scrutiny. He met her gaze steadily, letting her see what she needed to see. My husband told me about the conversation he had with one of his men, the older cowboy who talked about old souls and memories from before. Catherine's voice was measured, careful. Most of the men laughed it off as superstition, the kind of thing old-timers say when they can't explain something rationally. But Thomas didn't laugh, and neither did I when he told me. There are things in this world that don't have easy explanations, Mr. Thornton. Some things you simply have to experience to believe. Jack thought about the hours he had spent with Goldie and Russet standing over him, the deliberate way they had positioned themselves to protect him from the sun, the intelligence he had seen in their eyes. I believe there's something different about those horses. I don't know what it is or how to explain it, but I know what I saw. They made a choice to help me, and that's not normal animal behavior. Catherine nodded slowly, as if he had passed some kind of test. 8 years ago, my father was dying. Cancer, the doctor said. Nothing to be done but make him comfortable in his final weeks. He came to stay with us here at the ranch because he wanted to see the land one more time, wanted to die under open skies instead of in some hospital room. Her voice grew thick with memory. One afternoon he wandered away from the house. We searched everywhere, panicked that he had collapsed somewhere. It was Sarah who found him, or rather, it was 2 wild horses who found him and led Sarah to where he had fallen. The parallel was too obvious to ignore, and Jack felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Goldie and Russet were wild horses. Catherine shook her head, not wild in the usual sense. They had no brands, no signs of ever being broken or trained, but they weren't afraid of humans either. They stood with my father, just like they stood with you, protecting him from the sun until we could reach him. And when Sarah approached, they let her walk right up to them, let her touch them as if they had been waiting for her specifically. Jack processed this information, trying to fit it into some rational framework and failing. What happened after that? Did they just leave? Catherine's smile was soft with remembrance. No. They followed Sarah back to the ranch, and they've been with us ever since. They don't need to be fenced or tied. They stay because they choose to stay. And every so often, maybe once or twice a year, they disappear for a few days. When they come back, there's always a story about someone they helped, someone who was lost or injured or in trouble. The locals have started calling them guardian angels, though we never use that term ourselves. Seems too fanciful, yet the evidence was undeniable. Jack had been saved by horses who apparently made a habit of rescuing people in distress. It should have been impossible, should have been dismissed as coincidence or exaggeration, but he had experienced it firsthand. He knew what those animals had done for him, knew it with a certainty that transcended logic or reason. Before he could respond, Thomas Brennan entered the room, his weathered face creasing into a smile when he saw Jack awake and alert. Good to see you conscious and talking. You gave us quite a scare there for a while. The rancher moved to stand at the foot of the bed, his hands resting on the wooden frame. My wife's been taking good care of you, I trust. His tone was light, but his eyes held the same assessing quality Catherine's had shown earlier. These people were protective of their secrets, careful about who they shared them with. She's been more than kind, Jack replied, and I understand I owe you and your men my life as well. I don't have much, but whatever I can do to repay the debt, I will. The offer was sincere, driven by the code Jack had lived by his entire life. A debt was a debt, and it needed to be honored regardless of the cost. Thomas waved a hand dismissively, though appreciation flickered in his eyes. No debt. We help people out here because that's what neighbors do. The desert doesn't care about property lines or whether you know someone's name. When someone's in trouble, you help. It's that simple. He paused, then added with a slight smile, though I wouldn't turn down some assistance once you're healed up. We're always short-handed during spring roundup, and a man who works for the Morrison outfit likely knows his way around cattle. Jack felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there. These people were offering him more than just recovery time. They were offering him a place, temporary perhaps, but a place nonetheless. The Morrison Ranch felt very far away now, distant in more than just miles. He realized he was not eager to return to that life of solitary wandering, not after experiencing what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. "I'd be honored to help once I'm back on my feet." The words came easily, naturally, as if some part of him had already made the decision without consulting his conscious mind. Thomas nodded, satisfied, and Catherine smiled with what looked like approval. They had taken his measure and found him acceptable, and that acceptance felt more valuable than gold. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew their attention, and through the window Jack could see Sarah leading 2 horses toward the house. Even from this distance, he recognized them immediately. Goldie's golden coat gleamed in the afternoon sun, and Russet's bay coat was burnished like copper. The horses moved with Sarah in perfect harmony. No ropes or halters needed to keep them by her side. It was a remarkable sight, this young girl and 2 extraordinary animals moving as if they were parts of a single being. "They're coming to see you," Catherine said softly. "Sarah must have told them you were awake." The casual way she spoke about horses understanding human speech and responding to information should have seemed absurd, but Jack found himself accepting it as simply another aspect of this strange reality he had stumbled into. Normal rules did not seem to apply to Goldie and Russet. They operated according to laws he did not yet understand, but was beginning to respect. Thomas moved to the window and opened it wider, letting in the fresh air and the sounds of the ranch. Sarah led the horses right up to the window, close enough that their heads could extend through the opening. Both animals immediately focused on Jack, their dark eyes finding him with unmistakable recognition. Goldie nickered softly, a sound of greeting and concern, while Russet's ears swiveled forward with complete attention. Jack found himself pushing up despite the pain in his ribs, needing to acknowledge these creatures who had saved him. Catherine moved to support his back with pillows, understanding without words what he needed to do. Once he was propped up enough to reach the window, he extended a shaking hand toward Goldie. The Palomino stretched her neck forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her soft muzzle into his palm with exquisite gentleness. The contact sent emotion flooding through Jack with unexpected intensity. This animal had stood over him in the desert, had protected him from death with nothing to gain for herself. She had chosen compassion over indifference, had somehow known that he needed help, and had provided it without hesitation. Jack had spent his entire life believing that such kindness was rare in the world, that most creatures, human and animal alike, looked after their own interests first and foremost. Yet here was living proof that he had been wrong. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling. "I don't know why you helped me, but thank you." Goldie's eyes seemed to hold understanding, and she leaned further into his touch as if offering comfort. Russet moved closer then, nudging Goldie gently aside so he too could touch Jack, and the bay's breath was warm against his face. For several long moments, the 3 of them remained connected, human and horses sharing something that transcended species and language. Sarah stood outside watching with tears streaming down her face, though these were clearly tears of joy rather than sorrow. "They remember you. I knew they would. They never forget someone they've helped." Her voice carried the certainty of absolute belief, the kind of faith that came from personal experience with miracles. She reached up to stroke Russet's neck, her small hand barely spanning the powerful muscles beneath his glossy coat. "They've been asking about you." "I know that sounds crazy, but they have. They kept going to the barn where we put your things, kept standing by this window. They knew you were in here." Thomas Brennan moved to stand beside his daughter, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder in a gesture of paternal affection and support. 8 years we've had these horses, and they still manage to surprise us. still managed to do things that defy explanation. He looked at Jack directly. Most people, when we tell them about Goldie and Russet, they smile and nod but don't really believe. They think we're exaggerating or seeing patterns where there aren't any. You're different. You believe because you've seen it yourself. Jack nodded slowly, unable to deny the truth of those words. He had been as skeptical as anyone before this happened, would have dismissed such stories as frontier tall tales or wishful thinking. But experiencing it firsthand had changed everything. These horses were extraordinary in ways that could not be explained by training or coincidence or selective memory. They possessed some quality, some capability that set them apart from normal animals, and he had been the beneficiary of that remarkable nature. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that seemed to set the desert landscape on fire with color. It was beautiful in a way that Jack had never quite appreciated before, this harsh land that had nearly claimed his life but had also brought him to this moment, this place, these people. He was beginning to understand that the desert was not his enemy, had never been his enemy. It simply was indifferent and eternal, and how one experienced it depended entirely on perspective and circumstance. Catherine suggested that Sarah take the horses back to the stable before full evening fell, and the girl agreed reluctantly, clearly not wanting to end the reunion. But she promised Jack she would bring them back tomorrow, and the day after that, as many times as he wanted while he was recovering. The horses seemed reluctant to leave as well, both of them lingering at the window until Sarah called to them softly. Only then did they turn away, following the girl with the same perfect harmony they had shown earlier. After they left, silence settled over the room, comfortable and thoughtful. Thomas remained by the window, his eyes distant as he watched his daughter lead the horses across the yard. Jack could see the love in his expression, the fierce protectiveness that fathers felt for their children, but also something else. Pride, perhaps, or maybe gratitude that his daughter had been given such an extraordinary gift. Not many girls her age could walk with magical horses and communicate with them as easily as speaking to another human. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of decisions made. "You'll stay with us while you heal. That's not negotiable. But afterward, if you want to move on, return to the Morrison Ranch. We'll understand. However, if you're looking for a place, we could use a good hand here at the Triple Crown. The work's hard and the pay's fair, and you'd be part of something." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Something that matters. The offer hung in the air between them, significant and life-changing. Jack had been drifting for years, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots or form real connections. It had seemed like freedom at the time, this ability to pack up and leave whenever he felt the walls closing in. But lying here now, having nearly died alone in the desert, he was beginning to question whether freedom and isolation were really the same thing. Perhaps what he had been calling independence was actually just fear dressed up in noble clothing. "I would like that," Jack heard himself say, and the words felt right in a way few things in his life ever had. "I would like to stay." Catherine smiled, a warm expression that transformed her face, and Thomas nodded with satisfaction. The decision had been made, simple as that, and Jack felt something settle in his chest. A sense of rightness, of pieces clicking into place after years of being scattered and disconnected. Over the following days, Jack's recovery progressed steadily under Catherine's expert care. She had a gift for healing that went beyond mere medical knowledge, an intuition about what the body needed and when. She knew when to push him to move more, to start rebuilding strength, and when to insist on rest. She understood pain management not just in terms of medicine, but in terms of distraction and mental attitude. Under her guidance, Jack found himself healing faster than he would have thought possible. Sarah visited daily, often bringing Goldie and Russet with her, The horses had become a regular presence at his window, checking on his progress with what could only be described as concern. Jack found himself talking to them, telling them about his life, his past, things he had never shared with another living soul. There was something about their patient attention, their non-judgmental presence, that made confession easy. They listened without offering advice or criticism, simply bearing witness to his story with acceptance. He told them about his mother's death, about how her loss had left a hole in his life that nothing had ever filled. He spoke about his father's emotional distance, the way the man had retreated into work after his wife died, leaving his son to navigate grief and adolescence alone. He confessed his own failures, the relationships he had sabotaged, the opportunities he had walked away from, the pattern of running that had defined his adult life. And through it all, Goldie and Russet stood at the window, their eyes holding his, their presence a steady reminder that he was no longer alone. Thomas stopped by each evening after the day's work was done, often bringing one of his men with him. Jack learned the names and stories of the ranch hands, discovered the rhythms and routines of the Triple Crown, began to understand the scope of the operation Thomas had built over decades of hard work. It was impressive, this empire carved out of unforgiving land through sheer determination and smart management. But what impressed Jack most was the loyalty Thomas commanded from his workers. These men respected their boss not just because he paid them, but because he treated them fairly, listened to their concerns, and led by example. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the room in shades of rose and gold, Thomas brought a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. Catherine raised an eyebrow at this but did not object, simply warning them not to overdo it given Jack's recent injuries. Once she left, Thomas poured 2 modest measures and handed one to Jack, settling into the chair by the bed with a satisfied sigh. Thomas raised his glass in a simple toast to second chances. Jack touched his glass to Thomas's and took a careful sip, the whiskey burning pleasantly down his throat and spreading warmth through his chest. It was good whiskey, smooth and aged, the kind a man saved for special occasions or important conversations. He suspected this was both. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the whiskey working its magic, loosening tensions and opening doors that might otherwise remain closed. Thomas stared out the window at the darkening prairie, his expression contemplative. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of long-held memories. "I told you about how Catherine's father was dying, how Goldie and Russet found him that first time. What I didn't tell you was what happened in the weeks that followed." Jack settled back against his pillows, sensing that he was about to hear something important, something these people rarely shared with outsiders. Thomas took another sip of whiskey, gathering his thoughts before continuing. Catherine's father, James, he lived for 3 more months after the horses came. The doctors couldn't explain it, said it was impossible, that the cancer should have taken him within weeks. But every day he got a little stronger, a little more himself. And every day Goldie and Russet would stand by his window just like they do with you now. The parallel was obvious, and Jack felt a chill run down his spine despite the whiskey's warmth. Thomas seemed to sense his reaction and nodded slowly. James spent those 3 months teaching Sarah everything he knew about horses, about the land, about life. He told her stories about his own childhood, passed down wisdom that had been in his family for generations. And he told her about the horses, about what he believed they really were. What did he believe? Jack's voice was barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell of this confession. Thomas met his eyes directly, and in the fading light his weathered face looked ancient, touched by mysteries that transcended ordinary experience. He believed they were spirits of some kind. Not ghosts exactly, but something older, something that existed between the world we see and the world we don't. He said that every generation or so, such creatures appear when the world needs them most, when there are people who have forgotten how to hope, how to trust, how to believe in anything beyond what they can touch and measure. Thomas paused, turning his glass in his hands. He said the horses came to remind us that magic still exists, that kindness is never wasted, that some things can't be explained, only experienced. Jack absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with his pragmatic worldview and failing utterly. A week ago, he would have dismissed such talk as superstitious nonsense, the kind of mystical thinking that frontier isolation sometimes produced in otherwise sensible people. But he had felt the intelligence in those horses' eyes, had experienced their deliberate care, had been saved by something that transcended normal animal behavior. He could no longer afford skepticism when the evidence was so overwhelming. "Do you believe that?" Jack asked. Jack, that they're spirits or whatever James thought they were? Thomas considered the question seriously, not answering immediately, giving it the weight it deserved. "I believe there are more things in this world than I can understand or explain. I believe that Goldie and Russet have saved at least a dozen people over the 8 years they've been with us. I believe they choose who they help and when, operating according to rules we can't see. And I believe that everyone they've helped has been changed by the experience, has gone on to live differently than they would have otherwise." The implications of that statement settled over Jack like a blanket. He was one of those people now. One of the ones who had been chosen and helped and presumably changed, but changed how, and toward what purpose? As if reading his thoughts, Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense. Every person the horses have saved, they all had something in common. They were all alone, isolated by choice or circumstance. They had all built walls around themselves to keep the world out. And they were all standing at a crossroads, whether they knew it or not, about to make choices that would define the rest of their lives. Jack felt exposed, as if Thomas could see straight through to his core, could read every defense mechanism and protective strategy he had employed over the years. It was uncomfortable and liberating all at once, this being truly seen by another human being. He wanted to deny it, to insist that his isolation had been practical rather than pathological, but the lie would not form. He had been alone because he was afraid, and that fear had nearly cost him everything. What happened to the others, the people the horses saved? Thomas's face softened with remembrance. Most of them found their way here eventually. Not all stayed permanently, but they came back, looking for something they couldn't name. Some found love, got married, started families. Others found purpose, discovered work that mattered to them. A few just found peace, made their peace with their pasts, and moved forward with clearer hearts. He paused, then added quietly, "Catherine's father said the horses were shepherds, guiding lost souls back to the path they were meant to walk." The whiskey was gone from both glasses, and Thomas made no move to pour more. The conversation had reached depths where alcohol was no longer necessary, where truth flowed freely without artificial lubrication. Jack found himself thinking about his own path, about the choices that had led him to that moment in the desert when death had seemed not just inevitable but somehow fitting. He had been so convinced that his solitary existence was noble, that independence was the highest virtue, that needing others was weakness. But lying there, broken in the sand, waiting to die alone, he had finally understood the difference between independence and isolation. One was strength, the ability to stand on your own when necessary. The other was fear, the refusal to let anyone close enough to hurt you. He had been living in fear for so long that he had forgotten what courage looked like, had mistaken running for moving forward, had confused emotional walls for boundaries. "I don't know how to be different," Jack admitted, the words coming from somewhere deep and honest within him. "I've been alone so long. I don't know how to be part of something, how to trust people, how to stay when things get difficult. I always leave before it gets too hard, before anyone can disappoint me, or I can disappoint them." The confession felt dangerous, like handing Thomas ammunition that could be used against him, but also strangely freeing. Thomas nodded with understanding, no judgment in his expression. "Nobody expects you to change overnight. Healing takes time, and I'm not just talking about your ribs." He gestured toward the window where darkness had fully fallen. "Those horses out there, they didn't fix you. They just gave you a chance to fix yourself, gave you time and space to make different choices. What you do with that chance is up to you." The truth of those words resonated through Jack's entire being. He had been given something precious, a second chance at life, and more importantly, a second chance at living rather than merely surviving. The horses had saved his body, but the real question was whether he would save his soul, whether he would have the courage to tear down the walls he had built and risk connection, community, love. Sarah's voice drifted in from outside, calling goodnight to the horses in their stable. The sound was sweet and young, full of innocence and hope, everything Jack had lost or never had to begin with. He thought about what Thomas had said, about lost souls finding their way to this ranch, about people being changed by their encounters with Goldie and Russet. Perhaps that was his purpose here, not just to heal physically, but to learn how to live differently, how to open his heart to possibilities he had spent decades avoiding. "I want to try," Jack said finally, meeting Thomas's eyes with determination he had not felt in years. "I want to learn how to stay, how to be part of this place, this family. I don't know if I can do it, but I want to try." Thomas's smile was warm and genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his weathered face. "That's all anyone can ask. The trying is what matters, not the guarantee of success." He stood, collecting the empty glasses, and paused at the door. "Get some rest. Tomorrow Catherine wants to get you out of that bed for a short walk. Says your muscles need to start remembering how to work or they'll forget entirely." His tone was light, but Jack could hear the underlying message. Recovery required action, participation, the willingness to push through discomfort toward healing. After Thomas left, Jack lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Horses moving in their stalls, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft murmur of voices as ranch hands finished their evening duties and headed to the bunkhouse. It was a symphony of community, of people and animals living together in purposeful harmony. And Jack realized he had been missing this his entire life without knowing it. The silence of his solitary existence had seemed peaceful, but it had actually been empty, devoid of the richness that came from being woven into the fabric of other lives. Sleep came more easily than it had in years, untroubled by the restless dreams that usually plagued him. When he woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window and Catherine was already in the room, laying out clean clothes that looked like they would fit him reasonably well. "Good morning. Time to get you vertical and moving. Your ribs have had almost 3 weeks to start knitting together. If you stay in that bed much longer, you'll turn into a permanent fixture." Her tone brooked no argument, but her eyes were kind. The process of getting out of bed and dressed was harder than Jack anticipated, every movement pulling at muscles that had weakened during his convalescence and reminding him of injuries still healing. But Catherine was patient, helping when necessary, but also knowing when to step back and let him struggle through on his own. By the time he was dressed and standing upright, he was sweating and breathing hard, but also feeling a sense of accomplishment that had been absent for too long. Catherine supported him as they made their way slowly down the hall and out onto the wide front porch of the ranch house. The morning air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass, and Jack filled his lungs with it gratefully. From this vantage point, he could see the full scope of the Triple Crown spread out before him. Corrals and barns, pastures dotted with cattle and horses, outbuildings for various purposes, all arranged with the kind of thoughtful efficiency that spoke of years of experience and planning. Sarah was in one of the corrals working with a young horse, putting it through its paces with patience and skill that belied her youth. Goldie and Russet stood at the fence watching her, their heads turned in perfect synchronization as they tracked her movements. When they sensed Jack's presence on the porch, both horses immediately turned their attention to him, and he could have sworn he saw recognition and pleasure in their eyes. They nickered in greeting, and Sarah looked up, her face breaking into a wide smile. "You're up." She tied off the young horse and jogged over to the porch, breathless with excitement. "How do you feel? Are you dizzy? Does it hurt too much?" Her concern was genuine and touching, and Jack found himself smiling despite the discomfort radiating from his ribs. "I feel like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle, but Catherine assures me that's normal." His voice was stronger than it had been, though still rough around the edges. Sarah laughed, a sound like bells, and he realized how much joy this girl brought to everyone around her. She had that rare quality of making people feel seen and valued, of drawing out the best in those who knew her. It was a gift, one that her parents had clearly nurtured with care. Over the following weeks, Jack's recovery progressed from tentative walks on the porch to longer excursions around the ranch yard, then eventually to light work that rebuilt his strength without overtaxing his healing ribs. Thomas assigned him tasks that were important, but not physically demanding, giving him purpose while respecting his limitations. Jack found himself checking fence posts, organizing tack in the barn, helping Catherine with the garden she maintained behind the house. Each task was small, manageable, but together they added up to contribution, to being part of the ranch's daily rhythm. What surprised Jack most was how naturally he settled into life at the Triple Crown. He had expected to feel restless, to hear the familiar call to move on that had characterized his adult life. But that urge never came. Instead, he felt something he had not experienced since childhood, a sense of belonging that went deeper than mere employment or temporary shelter. The Brennan family had welcomed him not just as a worker, but as part of their extended family, including him in meals and conversations and decisions as if he had always been there. Sarah appointed herself his guide to the ranch's operations, teaching him the specific ways the Triple Crown did things. She showed him which horses preferred which handling, which cattle were prone to wandering, which pastures were best for different seasons. But more than that, she taught him about connection, about reading animals and understanding their needs, about approaching work with joy rather than mere duty. Watching her with Goldie and Russet was particularly instructive, the way she communicated with them through body language and soft sounds, the trust that flowed between girl and horses like visible light. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after his rescue, Jack was helping Sarah brush Goldie and Russet in the stable when she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Are you going to stay?" Her voice was casual, but he could hear the anxiety beneath it. "Papa says you're healed enough to leave if you want to. Says he'd understand if you needed to move on, go back to your old life." She kept her eyes on Goldie's coat, brushing with careful strokes, but her body was tense with waiting. Jack paused in his work on Russet's mane, considering his answer carefully. A month ago, he would have already been planning his departure, mentally calculating how much money he needed before he could move to the next ranch, the next job, the next temporary situation that asked nothing of him beyond physical labor. But something fundamental had shifted inside him during his time at the Triple Crown. He had discovered that staying required more courage than leaving, that opening yourself to connection and community demanded a strength he had never had to exercise while drifting alone. "I'm going to stay," he said finally, and the words felt like a vow, a commitment that went beyond mere employment. "If your family will have me, I'd like to make this my home." Sarah's face lit up with pure happiness, and she threw her arms around him in an impulsive hug that made his ribs protest, but his heart soar. Goldie and Russet both turned their heads toward him, and he would swear on anything sacred that they looked satisfied. as if this outcome was exactly what they had been working toward all along. 6 months after the desert had nearly claimed him, Jack Thornton stood at the same window where he had first seen Goldie and Russet after his rescue, watching the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. His ribs had healed completely, leaving only faint scars on his skin and deeper marks on his soul, the kind that changed a man from the inside out. He had put on weight, filled out from regular meals and the security of knowing where his next one would come from. But more than his physical appearance had changed. The perpetual wariness in his eyes had softened, replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment. The Triple Crown Ranch had become home in ways Jack had never imagined possible. He knew every fence line, every water source, every quirk of the land and the animals that lived on it. He knew which horses liked to have their ears scratched and which preferred to be left alone until they approached you first. He knew where Catherine kept the good coffee and that Thomas liked his eggs over easy with extra pepper. He knew that Sarah sang to the horses when she thought no one was listening, her voice sweet and clear in the morning stillness. These were the small intimacies of daily life that he had denied himself for so long, and now he could not imagine existing without them. Thomas had made him foreman 3 months ago, a promotion that spoke of trust earned and competence demonstrated. Jack had protested at first, uncomfortable with the responsibility and authority, but Thomas had been adamant. "You know this ranch as well as anyone who has worked here for years. The men respect you. You make good decisions. And more importantly, you care about this place and the people in it. That's what makes a good foreman." The title came with a modest raise and a small house on the property, just big enough for one man who was learning that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing. The ranch hands who had initially viewed Jack with the suspicious reserve frontiersman showed all strangers had gradually accepted him as one of their own. They shared their stories around evening fires, included him in their rough humor, and trusted him to have their backs when work got dangerous. Jack had discovered that being part of a team did not diminish his independence, but actually enhanced it. That strength could come from connection rather than isolation. He had spent so many years believing he had to face everything alone, and it was liberating to finally understand that was not true. Sarah had become something like the younger sister Jack never had, following him around when her chores allowed, asking endless questions about his past and his thoughts on everything from horse training to the meaning of life. He had never been comfortable with children before, had not known how to talk to them or what they needed from adults, but Sarah made it easy, her genuine curiosity and open heart creating space for connection without pressure or expectation. She had shown him that vulnerability was not weakness, but actually a form of courage, that opening yourself to others required more strength than keeping them at arm's length. Catherine and Thomas had become the closest thing to parents Jack had known since his own mother died. They offered guidance without judgment, support without strings attached, and a model of partnership that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about relationships. Watching them navigate decades of marriage with respect and affection and occasional disagreement that never diminished their fundamental bond taught Jack that love was not the fragile, dangerous thing he had always believed it to be. It could be strong enough to weather storms, flexible enough to accommodate change, and deep enough to last a lifetime. But it was Goldie and Russet who remained at the center of Jack's transformation, constant reminders of the mystery that had saved him and continued to work in ways he could not fully comprehend. The horses still disappeared occasionally, vanishing for a few days before returning with that knowing look in their eyes that suggested they had been about their mysterious work. 3 weeks ago, they had brought back a young woman who had been thrown from her horse and broken her ankle miles from help. Before that, an elderly prospector who had gotten turned around in a canyon system and run out of water. Each time, the pattern was the same. The horses would find someone in need, protect them until help arrived, then return home as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Jack had asked Sarah once if she knew why the horses did what they did, what drove them to seek out and save people who were lost or injured or dying. She had looked at him with those wise young eyes and said something he would never forget. They remember what it feels like to need help. They remember being alone and afraid and thinking nobody cared. So they make sure nobody else has to feel that way, not if they can prevent it. He did not know if she was right, did not know if horses could remember such things, or if they were motivated by compassion in the way humans understood it. But he knew that their actions had given him back his life, and not just the biological fact of continued existence, but the chance to actually live, to connect, to love and be loved in return. The sun had fully risen now, flooding the prairie with morning light that revealed a landscape Jack had once viewed as his enemy, but now understood as simply indifferent, beautiful, and harsh in equal measure. The desert had not tried to kill him that day 6 months ago. It had simply been itself, and he had been unprepared and unlucky and alone. But he was not alone anymore, would never be alone again if he had anything to say about it. He had found his place in the world, not through his own efforts, but through grace, through the mysterious workings of two extraordinary horses who had looked at a dying man and decided he was worth saving. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind him, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered one to Jack without a word, and they stood together watching the ranch come to life below them. Men emerging from the bunkhouse, horses moving in the corrals, Sarah already up and checking on the newest foal born just yesterday. It was a scene of purposeful activity, of life being lived with intention and care, and Jack was part of it all. He belonged here, not because he had earned it through exceptional skill or because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had been chosen, saved, transformed by forces he would never fully understand but would always be grateful for. "Thank you," he said quietly, though he was not sure if he was speaking to Thomas or to the horses in the stable, or to whatever mysterious providence had brought him to this place at exactly the right moment. Thomas simply nodded, understanding without needing explanation, and they drank their coffee as the day began and the work called and the future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility and hope.